This is the clip people can't stop replaying, not because of what Erika Kirk said, but because of what she didn't say. One question, one pause, and suddenly the entire 2028 conversation shifted. Because when someone is given the cleanest chance possible to shut down speculation, and they don't take it, people start asking why. And once you see how this moment fits into everything else that's been happening around Erika Kirk, it starts to feel a lot less accidental. Because in politics, uncertainty isn't neutral, it's loaded. At first, this feels like a normal interview moment, a public figure navigating a sensitive topic. But the longer you sit with it, the more it starts to feel intentional, almost engineered to leave the door open without ever admitting the door exists. And once that realization clicks, it's hard to shake. This isn't about one quote, it's about the absence of a quote. Now rewind the timeline for a second, because this moment doesn't exist in isolation. Not long ago, Erika Kirk simply wasn't part of the national political ecosystem in this way. She wasn't being treated as a voice of authority. She wasn't being asked questions about the future of the movement. She wasn't being placed in rooms where power is discussed and shaped. And then very quickly, she was. The shift didn't happen gradually over years. It happened over months. One appearance turned into several. Several turned into a consistent media presence. Interviews became more frequent and, more importantly, more serious in tone. These weren't sympathy interviews anymore. They were directional. That matters, because the type of question someone is asked often tells you more than their answers ever could. When interviewers stop asking about feelings and start asking about vision, responsibility, and what comes next, it signals that the person on the other side of the table is being viewed differently. And Erika was being viewed differently. Now, when someone suddenly becomes more visible, there are usually two explanations. Either they're being pulled into the spotlight against their will, or they're stepping into it with purpose. And what's made this so fascinating is that Erika hasn't resisted the visibility. She's leaned into it, calmly, confidently, without apology. That's where the tension starts to form. Because people who want privacy usually draw boundaries. They redirect. They downplay. They narrow the scope of the conversation. Erika hasn't done that. Instead, she's allowed the scope to widen. And that widening is what led us to this moment. The question about 2028. This wasn't asked randomly. It wasn't out of nowhere. It came after weeks of increasing exposure, authority-style language, and positioning that already had people wondering where this was heading. So when the question finally landed, the room felt different. This wasn't curiosity anymore, it was a test. And here's where everything changes. If Erika wanted to put an end to speculation permanently, this was the cleanest opportunity she would ever get. A simple denial would have been enough. A calm dismissal. A statement about focusing on the present. Instead, she did something far more interesting. She reframed the entire idea of looking ahead. She talked about how people rush forward too quickly, how short attention spans pull focus away from the present moment, how important it is to appreciate what's happening now. On the surface, it sounds thoughtful, even wise. But underneath that framing is something else. She didn't say no. And in politics, not saying no is a decision. Because public figures understand how speculation works. They understand how clips travel. They understand that silence gets filled in by other people's interpretations. So when someone at this level chooses ambiguity, it's rarely accidental. That's why this clip didn't disappear. It spread. People watched it again and again, each time listening for a line that never came. Each time wondering whether they missed something. Each time feeling like the answer was carefully constructed to say everything except the thing that would shut the conversation down. And that's when the speculation stopped being fringe and started becoming mainstream. Now let's layer in everything else that's been happening around this moment, because this is where the story really deepens. Erika's recent public appearances don't just show increased confidence, they show command. She's not tentative. She's not deferential. She's not positioning herself as adjacent to power. She speaks like someone who belongs in the room. Her language has shifted from personal reflection to moral framing. She talks about what's acceptable, what's unhealthy, what needs to stop, and what people should understand. That's not the language of someone staying out of the arena. That's the language of someone shaping the arena. And again, this doesn't mean she's running, but it explains why people think she could. Now add the symbolic moments into the mix, the turning point event, the emotional buildup, the hug that lingered just long enough to feel meaningful, the explanation afterward that dissected the moment instead of brushing it off. Symbolism is powerful, even when unintended. And once symbolism enters the conversation, people start constructing narratives whether you want them to or not. That's exactly what happened here. People started revisiting earlier clips, earlier interviews, earlier comments. Things that once sounded like personal reflections now sounded like early positioning. Not because they were meant that way, but because context had changed. And context changes everything. Now here's the key thing most people miss. Erika Kirk doesn't need to run for president for this to matter. She doesn't need to announce anything. She doesn't need to confirm anything. The moment people seriously consider the possibility, the political environment shifts, media coverage shifts, donor conversations shift. Strategic calculations shift, and that's why this moment feels so significant, because it introduced a variable into a space that thrives on predictability. Now look at the reactions. Some people are inspired by the idea. They see resilience, strength, and purpose emerging from tragedy. Others are deeply uncomfortable. They feel the rise is too fast, too polished, too strategically timed. And then there's the largest group, the observers, the people who aren't convinced of anything but also aren't dismissing it. Those people are watching closely because they sense something unresolved. And unresolved moments are where political narratives are born. Now let's address the title itself. Erika Kirk confirms she's running for president in 2028. The confirmation here isn't literal. It's psychological. It's the confirmation that she is no longer closing the door. It's the confirmation that speculation isn't irrational. It's the confirmation that her role has changed, even if her title hasn't. And that's why this feels like the beginning of a story, not the middle or the end. Beginnings feel like this: ambiguous, tense, slightly uncomfortable, full of unanswered questions. Now zoom out and ask yourself one final thing. If Erika Kirk wanted this conversation to stop, really stop, what would she have done differently? Would she have answered that question the same way? Would she have leaned into visibility instead of stepping back? Would she have allowed ambiguity to linger this long? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that these questions exist at all tells you something important. The perception has shifted. And in politics, perception is often the first domino to fall. Nothing has been announced. Nothing has been confirmed in the traditional sense. And once a narrative starts moving on its own, like that, it develops a kind of gravity. It begins pulling everything around it into orbit, even moments that, on their own, might not have meant much at all. That's exactly what's happening now. Because every new Erika Kirk appearance isn't being watched in isolation anymore. It's being watched through the lens of that unanswered question. Every sentence gets weighed. Every pause gets examined. Every time she chooses to elaborate on one thing and skip another, people notice. And the fascinating part is that none of this requires intent. Political intrigue doesn't need a mastermind behind it. It just needs enough ambiguity for people to start filling in the gaps themselves. Now think about the position Erika Kirk is in. She's not a politician by training. She didn't come up through campaigns or policy circles. She didn't spend years running for smaller offices. Her rise into this space is emotional, symbolic, and narrative-driven. And historically, those are the figures that disrupt systems the most, because they don't follow the expected script. They don't speak like politicians. They don't move like politicians. They don't frame things in the same cautious, legalistic way. Instead, they speak in values, meaning, responsibility, and destiny. And whether people realize it or not, that kind of language lands very differently. It feels bigger than policy. It feels moral. It feels personal. That's why some people feel drawn in and others feel uneasy. Now let's talk about the speed of this. Speed matters. If Erika Kirk had slowly increased her presence over years, this would feel normal. But that's not what happened. This felt like a switch flipped. 1 month she's rarely seen, the next she's unavoidable. And rapid elevation always triggers suspicion, even when it's deserved. People start asking questions like, who's backing this? Who's pushing this? Who benefits? Again, those questions don't require answers to be powerful. The act of asking them alone creates tension, and tension is fuel. Now here's where the speculation takes another step forward. People aren't just asking whether Erika Kirk could run, they're asking whether the movement itself might want her to. Not officially, not formally, but emotionally. Movements don't just choose leaders based on experience. They choose leaders based on what they represent in a specific moment. And right now, Erika represents continuity after chaos, stability after loss, purpose emerging from tragedy. That's potent. And when something is potent, people project futures onto it. That's why you're seeing comments that sound almost surreal. People talking about inevitability, about destiny, about history repeating itself in unexpected ways. Not because they have evidence, but because the story feels like it's setting something up. But something has changed. The public no longer sees Erika Kirk as just a supporting figure in someone else's story. She's now part of the future conversation, whether she asked for it or not. And once that happens, the narrative doesn't wait for permission. It moves on its own. And right now, it's moving fast. Anyway, this concludes today's video. Be sure to subscribe to LoafTube for future celebrity videos and turn on that post notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Until then, see you in the next one.